the Spirit of Jazz podcast, where music dances with mystery, with your hosts, Bill Carter and Jeff Kellam.
Welcome back to the Spirit of Jazz podcast. This is Bill Carter.
And I'm still Jeff Kellam, and it's really good to be back in the saddle here, or sitting on the bandstand, or wherever we are, Bill.
We are in our little cubicles, digital cubicles. But we've had a nice break, and it's been good. And, we've been kind of busy doing our own pursuits. So, Jeff, for today, tell us what you've been up to.
In the past few months, I've been doing a radio show each week on a community radio station in Binghamton, New York, WBBY. It's an hour of vinyl that I have stored up in the attic, and now much of it's on the floor. So that's been great. In fact, it's kind of an educational experience. I'm assuming that many people in the station don't know anything about jazz because the station plays all kinds of different programs. It doesn't have a format except it's community. And then the programs are picked up by stations around the country. So this program is on in San Antonio, Texas, and Freeport, Maine, Geneva, New York.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. So that's one thing I've been doing. And then once a month, I co-host a TV program on a local TV station here called Encounter.
Well, you were telling me before about one of your recent guests. Tell our audience.
I went to this listening session in our downtown area here in Owego, New York, and it was listening to A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. The needle went down on one side of the record and didn't come up until the end of the record, flipped it over, listened to the other side, and we sat in a circle, about 15 people. Not a word was spoken. Nobody looked at their phones. Mm. It was just people were paying attention to the music. And then we had a couple of folks who knew something about John Coltrane, and others knew something about A Love Supreme. And the guy that was kind of hosting this was Dante Di Stefano, who's a poet, and he teaches high school English at a local high school. Mm-hmm. So I asked Dante to come on the program and talk about John Coltrane's pilgrimage in his life and his journey through some very hard times. When he came out of it, he became almost an evangelist for the spirit of jazz. So that was the conversation. You want to hear it?
I think our listeners would love to hear it. Let's make that the centerpiece of this week's show.
Okay, once again, it's Dante Di Stefano talking about A Love Supreme by John Coltrane, classic album.
Today, we're going to tell the story of an artist. Someone whose art was inspiring and entertaining, and then he declined into the darkness of addiction and realized that darkness was going to overwhelm the gifts that he had to share, and he'd be denying himself as well as the audiences who enjoyed the art that he presented through his music. And then, because he realized this darkness was pretty much killing him, he went home and closed himself in a room for days and cold turkey quit his addiction to heroin. Later, he also stopped drinking, and then through his redemption and gratitude for finding this light in his life, he wrote a jazz masterpiece called A Love Supreme. John Coltrane is his name. Now, many people like jazz. Many people are not so excited about jazz. But if you've never heard of John Coltrane, this story is fascinating. And if you are not at all into jazz, don't worry. We're talking about the humanity of an artist whose album called A Love Supreme is probably one of the most important albums in the jazz discography. My guest today is Dante Di Stefano, who is a teacher at Union Endicott High School. He is a poet. He's been on Encounter before with not that much beard. We were in your living room, and Joe interviewed you about your poetry, and I remember two words that, my memory ain't great when you go back that far, Dad and Rivers. Have I got them right?
You do, yes. That was my first book, and that was a lot about the death of my father, and a lot about the Broome County area and growing up, and the rivers figure prominently in that book. So.
Right. And I remembered your voice when I saw you at the Tioga County Arts Council doing this wonderful event. Imagine 14 people sitting in folding chairs, listening as the needle drops on side one of a record, and then side two. No one says a word. People are just listening. No one checks their phone. Some heads are bobbing back and forth to the beat. Some people are tapping their feet. One person is feeling it in his body as he rocks back and forth. They were listening to A Love Supreme by this jazz saxophone player, John Coltrane. Tioga County Arts Council put this thing on in a room decorated with art, inspired by the album. How'd this come to be?
Well, I'm a lifelong jazz fan, and John Coltrane is my favorite jazz musician, and kind of the figure in the arts who I find most inspiring and interesting. And so my wife, who's the executive director of the Tioga Arts Council and has been for several years, decided that it would be a good idea to continue some of the multimedia exhibits that we do with a tribute to John Coltrane, and particularly thinking about how local artists and poets from across the country might engage A Love Supreme and Coltrane's legacy. So we had poets from Washington, D.C., and Vermont, and Georgia, and some local poets as well, responding to A Love Supreme, the album. And then we had, my wife made broadsides, which are kind of like, one sheets that have the poem on them, and then paired it with the visual art paintings that were hanging in the gallery.
Yeah.
So she created this dialogue between the music and the visual art. There was also an audio visual, what do you call it? VR, virtual reality exhibit where you could find out things about Coltrane and the album in that way. So it was very much in spirit of the album A Love Supreme, because A Love Supreme is an album that began with poetry, because at this time, when he recorded this in 1964, he was newly in love with Alice McLeod, who became his wife, Alice Coltrane. They were newly married. They had a young son, and he was writing poetry to her, which was not something that he had done much before, although in his early years he was exposed to Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry through his maternal grandfather, who was a minister in the Methodist Church. Both of his grandfathers were ministers, so he grew up in the church, and he grew up with two parents who, his father was a tailor, his mother was a seamstress. Both of them were musicians, amateur musicians. His father played fiddle and guitar. His mother played the piano. And of course, they had the music of the church. So he grew up in the gospel tradition. He grew up saturated with the blues. He was born in North Carolina, in Hamlet, a small town in North Carolina, in 1926. That's the same years as some of the first Hot 5 recordings from Louis Armstrong came out. So his lifetime kind of spans this whole arc of recorded jazz in an interesting way. He dies in 1967 of liver cancer at 40 years old. So he's grounded in the church. An interesting story about this too is that when his father and many of his other relatives die when he's 13, his maternal grandparents die, one of his aunts dies, he eventually moves to Philadelphia when he's 18 after he finishes school in North Carolina. And by that time, he was really immersed in playing the saxophone. He'd started playing the clarinet, but he got hooked on Lester Young. So he transitioned to the alto sax and then the tenor sax. And when he moves to Philadelphia, he's living in apartments in Philadelphia that they're very close together, and he's practicing all the time, and his neighbors get mad, and a local minister finds out that he's, his neighbors are threatening to kick his hand out, who he's living with, and he offers Coltrane the ability to practice in his church. So when he's 18, 19 years old, he's practicing in an empty church by himself.
Yeah.
And then years later, after kicking his heroin addiction, as you mentioned, and after a lot of other things, he returns with this incredible love note to the Almighty, which is, kind of a really audacious act, but so there's something about his life that all of these experiences culminated in this album, I think.
And that's probably true of all of our stories, not as publicly as Coltrane's, but when I look at my story, both my grandfathers worked at IBM. And I think 3 or 4 members of my family had worked at IBM. My dad worked at IBM. So that's part of what made us who we were. And then there are others in this community who worked at EJ. And so the whole EJ neighborhoods, these things shape us. We grow up, many of us went to church as kids. Many of us dropped out as, teenagers or adults. Many of us faced the same temptations that Coltrane faced. Some of us crawl out of it and find redemption and salvation, through either the work of someone else or on our own. He found it on his own. He he didn't go into rehab someplace. He closed the door, right? What's that story?
Well, he's. I
don't mean to jump too far ahead.
No, that's he gets into, like a lot of jazz musicians at that time, a lot of them idolized Charlie Parker, who was a heroin addict and was a revolutionary on the instrument. So, it's kind of like those cliches about poetry. You think about somebody like Dylan Thomas, who was a drunk, and equating like alcoholism with inspiration, or things like that are kind of a cliche, a trap that artists have fallen into. When you think about artists like John Coltrane, also you think about someone who's really intense, searching, and that type of personality can fall into addiction perhaps more easily, also given their genetics, right? So he starts his addiction when he's working with Dizzy Gillespie and Dizzy Gillespie's big band, and just a little bit before that, he gets addicted to heroin. He's also drinking heavily, and he gets kicked out of Dizzy Gillespie's band. He goes into Miles Davis's classic quintet, where he records Kind of Blue, which is probably the most famous jazz album of this time period, and he's got trouble. Miles Davis has troubles with addiction on his own, but eventually it becomes too problematic. By 1957, he realizes that he can't continue like this, and as you said, he quits cold turkey, which is incredibly hard to do. And then there's this process of realizing a kind of spiritual, kind of quest that began early in his life, but really, the velocity of it really picks up after he kicks heroin. And the constant through all of this is his love of music, and he's somebody who practiced all the time. When he was first married to Naima Coltrane, his first wife, if guests would come to the house, he'd be practicing, and if she wasn't there, he wouldn't open the door. He was practicing all the time. When he had gigs, he would be practicing in the dressing room before going on stage, or in the back of the club before going on stage. He was always playing. He was so inside the music that there's a kind of spiritual practice to that as well, a devotion through music. And Coltrane also had this belief in, always striving toward the good, and that music could create kind of happiness for people and part of, he really gets to the bottom of a certain kind of expressivity in his playing. Mm-hmm. At the time in the 60s, when he's on Atlantic Records, there's some criticism of his playing. They call it sheets of sound. If you've listened to some of those albums, he's playing a lot of notes. Some jazz critics say he's playing too many notes, but he's trying to get everything out. There's an effusiveness that is also connected to the album A Love Supreme, trying to say everything that you can. And when you think about he dies at 40, there's that added poignancy and urgency to that. So, art kind of thresholds itself between restraint and effusion, and he's always kind of on the side of effusion, but he's also a technically very gifted and proficient player who's drawing on not only the jazz tradition, but also, Afro-Caribbean music, Indian music, Brazilian bossa nova, all kinds of world music, West African music. There were all these world music records that were coming out in the 50s and 60s that were inspiring these musicians. And then, of course, there were, Afro-Cubans in New York who were inspiring them too. So
we talked about the addiction issues of many jazz musicians and rock musicians too, and I'm sure classical musicians as well, but certainly jazz, I think, has the reputation that goes back to the roots of jazz in pretty dangerous alleys and small clubs, and I think the movie Bird about Charlie Parker shows how the young musicians get sucked into this drug culture, and it's tolerated until it starts affecting performance. That's when Miles Davis and others start kicking people out of their bands because they can't depend on them.
Right.
So that's probably part of the Coltrane story. Is it's the addiction's getting in the way of the music. It's not inspiring. It's not recreational. It's a terrible darkness.
Yeah.
Let me just, we're talking with Dante Di Stefano about this album called A Love Supreme that was showcased, I guess is a word, at the Tioga County Arts Council. Coltrane writes the jacket notes here and says, "Dear listener, all praise be to God, to whom all praise is due. Let us pursue him in the righteous path. Yes, it's true, seek and ye shall find. Only through him can we know the most wondrous bequeathal." It's a word I don't use very often in my own life. During the year 1957, I experienced, by the grace of God, a spiritual awakening which led me to a richer, fuller, more productive life. At that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through music. I feel this has been granted through his grace. All praise to God. And that's a theme which moves through this jacket note piece. And then he has the lyric to A Love Supreme, which you do not hear.
But you do hear it because he plays it. He transposes the music. He has this poem in the liner notes. In the final part of A Love Supreme is 4 parts: acknowledgement, resolution, pursuance, and psalm. Psalm is the last part. The last part, he's playing syllable by syllable the poem on his horn. So he's kind of transforming poetry into pure sound, which poetry is pure sound anyway. But he's transforming music into language, which is actually the reverse of what he does on the first track, Acknowledgement, because on the first track, Acknowledgement, he solos and he goes through this 4-note pattern, which is basically a musical transcription of the phrase "A Love Supreme." Da 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 da. He solos that over and over again. He goes through all 12 keys. He plays it in all these different registers, and then at the end of this long solo, he breaks into chant. And this is very unusual for a jazz record. Before this, there are other jazz records where this happens, but it's as if he's exhausted in acknowledgement the possibilities of musical expressiveness on the saxophone, or as if he's kind of earning through his devotion to music the ability to vocalize in chant, right? Yeah. So it's an instruction on how to pray in some ways, yeah, which is a really interesting thing to me too. Right. And the symmetry of that both the beginning part, acknowledgement, and psalm have to do with the nexus of language and music, right? Yeah, yeah. And also prayer, and what prayer is, and how prayer is a corollary to both music and word. Yeah. You know,
I mentioned when we were at the Tiger County Arts Council listening to this music, and then the discussion afterward among the folks who gathered there. By the way, I have to say, a jazz musician friend of mine who grew up in Owego said when he heard about this event, John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme" being talked about in downtown Owego, he thought it was so. Owego wasn't exactly known as the jazz center of the Triple Cities, you know, or Tiger County for that matter. So, and I don't, you know, this came out of an Owego resident who said, "What's this happening here?" And
an interesting side note to that: Tioga County is where, in Candor, is where Moondog, the street musician and great jazz musician, lived for a long time. So there's that connection. And then for this album and the Coltrane Quartet, the classic Coltrane Quartet, yeah, they actually played on Susquehanna Street in Binghamton in 1962 or 63, October of one of those years, at Gentleman Joe's, which was a club on Susquehanna Street. I think the Press and Sun Bulletin has written an article about them. I know about it from a local guy who told me, who was a frequenter. A lot of young Italian guys would go there. So it was in the Italian neighborhood. Right. But a lot of acts came through there, like B.B. King, and you know, Coltrane was always touring. With this classic quartet that made "A Love Supreme," he was on the road 45 weeks of the year, man, playing 6 days a week, playing 3 or 4 sets a night. So you can't imagine a tighter band than that, you know.
And the personnel were John Coltrane on tenor sax, yep, McCoy Tyner piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums.
Yes.
One of the Jones boys.
One of the greatest. And of course, Garrison and Tyner were both Philadelphia guys, and they were about 10 years younger than Coltrane, and they saw him go through his heroin addiction. They were playing with him at the time, and you know, they were also, all 4 of those guys were really testing the limits of their instruments, you know. Garrison is as exploratory on the bass, if you listen to "A Love Supreme," as Coltrane is on the horn. And Elvin Jones, as a drummer, he doesn't only keep time, he's also very aware of the melody, and he's there's all this polyphonic kind of drumming that goes on top of the, you know, yeah, the swing that he maintains, you know. So and then of course McCoy Tyner is just an incredible talent on piano.
I hope I'm remembering this right, correctly, that when Coltrane was playing "A Love Supreme," I think it was McCoy Tyner who has this puzzled look on his face because he doesn't know where things are going. There's something that's taken over here, a spirit that's moving Coltrane, and the musicians are just thinking, well, okay, here we go. Yeah. It's not all written notes necessarily, no, you know.
It's all improvisation. It's all a discussion between the four musicians in the moment. And of course, they were practicing these parts of this suite on the road, all over the place, in small clubs, and in big clubs in New York and places like that. So they were familiar with the music, but when they get in the studios, in Rudy Van Gelder's studios in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, famous producer and recording engineer, they record the whole thing in 4 hours, which is amazing. There's not a lot of alternate takes on it. There's a little bit of overdubbing on Psalm. If you listen, another saxophone comes in at the end. There's the timpani, but then, which is Elvin Jones is playing, but then there's also some cymbal clashes that are playing at the same time. So there's not a lot of post-production. This is a time when recording technology was a lot simpler. There's 2 tracks. The guys don't have they don't have earphones in. Yeah. You know, they're listening to each other in the space that Rudy Van Gelder created for them.
A lot of people now are recording in a booth.
Yeah.
So you're isolated from the other musicians. You can hear them through their headphones, but that doesn't replicate the excitement and energy of a live performance where you can see each other,
right,
and as well as hear each other.
And you have to listen to each other too. That's the other thing, you know, which is also, you know, that conversation that unfolds in this album is also a model for Coltrane's belief in human interactions with the divine, you know.
Yeah. You know, it would be natural to say, oh, well, let's listen to a little piece of this. But how do you play an album on TV? And then, so that's very difficult. The radio stations could play it. They've got the licenses and stuff, but we can't do that. But it can be found. I think if people Google "A Love Supreme," John Coltrane, they'll find, you'll find the music online.
Yeah, you can find it on Spotify, on YouTube. There's only 3 recordings of it besides the album. There's a live recording in Seattle. There's a recording in Antibes. If you're a casual jazz listener, and you want to know why "A Love Supreme" is important, one reason is because it influenced generations of musicians. Immediately, it influences people like Bootsy Collins, Neil Young, Rick James, the guy from Earth, Wind and Fire, Maurice
White,
yep. Joni Mitchell. Santana, John McLaughlin, you know, like, so all different rock is very much influenced by this music. So is gospel, so is the Campbell Brothers in Rochester did a great pedal steel gospel rendition of "A Love Supreme." And so the influence is very pronounced, but also it's important to remember Coltrane only recorded for 12 years. That 12 years from 1955 to 1967, he accomplished more in those 12 years than you could accomplish in 7 or 8 lifetimes. That 12 years is also sandwiched between 1954 is Brown versus the Board of Education, and 1968 is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
So the whole arc of this intense period of civil rights struggle is soundtracked by Coltrane's recording career, and really this is his recording career is a kind of dramatization of kind of revolutionary Christian activism, thought. It's a precursor to the Black Power movement in a lot of ways, and it's really informed by what's going on in the United States at the time. So.
We don't get any feed. We're not pushing this album so that we get any kickback from this. There's no payola here. It's been our theme for this program to think of "A Love Supreme" as Coltrane's response to his liberation from his addiction and the focus of his music. Coltrane gives us a benediction for today. He says, "Live clean." This is from a book called "Experiencing Jazz: A Listener's Companion" by Michael Stevens. You can also find some Coltrane references in Bill Carter's wonderful book called "Thriving on a Riff: Jazz and the Spiritual Life." But Coltrane says, "Live cleanly, do right. You can improve as a player by improving as a person. It's a duty we owe to ourselves." He perceived music making as something akin to a religious experience.
Hey, Jeff, that's a great conversation. Thanks so much for sharing that with us and with all our listeners. I can't wait to meet Dante sometime. Seems like we are kindred spirits, and he knows a great deal about Coltrane.
He really does. He's done his homework, and he's such a communicator. I just love it. And thanks to WBNG-TV for sharing the soundtrack of the program with us.
Well, next time we're together, we'll talk a little bit about some things I've been dabbling with. But in the meantime, we're glad to have our listeners back for the Spirit of Jazz. This is Season 3, and I'm Bill Carter.
And I'm Jeff Kellam, reminding you that all the episodes of the Spirit of Jazz podcast are available wherever you find your podcasts, if indeed you've lost them.
Take good care.
Thanks for listening to the Spirit of Jazz podcast. This is a production of Press Bebop Music. To find out more about Press Bebop, our music, concerts, and recordings, please explore our website at www.pressbebop.com. And send us a note telling us what you think about the Spirit of Jazz. We'd love to hear from you. Check in with us again next time. I'm Jeff Kellam.
And I'm Bill Carter. Thanks for tuning in.